This is what I kind of describe as my Moses moment. I literally was like, I'm not your guy, God. There's got to be somebody else. And God's response was, you're my guy for testimonies. Welcome to When You Look, where ordinary people share their extraordinary experiences, and you get to decide, was it coincidence or God? What's up, everybody? It's Mick from When You Look. This is the backstory to how When You Look came into existence. Ready? Let's go. Do you know anybody that has a thing? Like a thing? Like it's their thing. The type of thing that's like so much them or so deep into them, or they're so into it, this particular thing, that they might even start a nonprofit over it. Well, I didn't have a thing because I'm not the kind of guy that has a thing. And yet at some point in 2018, I was given a thing. Like all of a sudden, out of nowhere, inside of me, I had this thing. And this thing was testimonies. Now, I didn't know what that meant, really. But along with testimonies came this verse, this scripture, this Bible verse of Revelation 12:11. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimonies. And they did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. That's what got put in me, deposited, if you will, at some point in 2018. And I'm like, this is weird. This is a thing. I don't have a thing. I'm not a thing kind of guy. And now I have this thing, testimonies. So I sort of put it out of my mind and I thought, okay, well, this is not going to be a thing. This isn't that big of a deal. And it just stayed there and it stuck around. And it stuck around to the point where I was like, man, this is like a thing. I might actually have to even do something with this thing. So I remember having a conversation with my wife. She was super pregnant with our twins at the time. And I remember explaining to her, I'm like, honey, this is not normal for me. You know, I'm not the guy with the thing. And this is a thing. And the thing is testimonies. And I think maybe, just maybe, I'm the guy who's supposed to do something with this. And that was just totally crazy to me. In late 2019, I get asked to go on a mission trip to Niger, Africa. And leading up to the lunch where I got asked to go on this trip, my wife and I had sort of rehearsed that I was going to say no to this person because I knew this was coming. This person that I had lunch with, when you have lunch with them, it's almost always going to include a request that you go on a mission trip to Niger, Africa. And I was at a point where I was like, I'm not going on this trip. And we as a family were at a point where we were like, I'm not going on this trip because we had 9-month-old twins and a 6-year-old at home. So it didn't make a lot of sense from our perspective for me to be going halfway around the world for a week to go on a mission trip to Niger. Well, at that lunch, it became crystal clear to me that I was going to Niger. In fact, as Michael slid across the table the dates for the trip, I literally knew as I saw them, because they were February of 2020, I knew that I was supposed to go. So I get home that evening after having lunch with Michael, and I say to my wife, I'm like, hey, we got to talk about how the lunch went. And she goes, yeah, that'll probably be quick. And my response was, well, not so much. So we sit down. I tell her the whole story. She knows that we were both aligned going into this, that the answer was not only no, but no. There's no way I'm going. And yet I explained to her, I knew I was going. In fact, I used the word inevitable because that's exactly what it felt like. It was inevitable. no matter what, it seemed like I was going on that trip. And my wife's response was, well, that's the Holy Spirit. So we planned accordingly as a family. We got the right support that we needed for her, for me to be gone for a week. We fundraised, and I'm in Niger, Africa in February of 2020. So the way those trips go is you're doing ministry work throughout the course of the day. And then after dinner and late in the evening, you're up on the rooftop of the building that we were staying in, essentially debriefing the day. And the mission group that I was with, which is Effective Ministries, Inc., put some information in the description about that and link below. It was commonplace for the rooftop experience to be a really important part of people's experiences while on those mission trips. And the typical debrief would go something to the extent of each person that was on the trip would be talking about their high for the day, their low for the day, and maybe some other observations. And then after we had done that as a full group, we would then break out into our individual spaces on this rooftop. And each person would spend some time talking with God. And then we would all come back together and debrief that if there was anything major that occurred. And then we would head basically back inside to go to bed. So we're a handful of days in. We're on this rooftop debrief. We've done our normal stuff, and we're now moved to our individual spots. And that is where I had what I consider to be a face-to-face encounter with God. So here's the deal. I didn't in any way, shape, or form see God, but I consider it to be face-to-face because it was me and him, and I was fully enveloped in him. I was completely consumed by him. And so I knew where I was. This wasn't some type of out-of-body experience. I could see as I would glance every once in a while that in the dark, twilight-ish, that, other people that I knew, of course, were on the rooftop, and they were, many, many feet or yards away from me because it's quite a substantial rooftop for maybe a total of a dozen people to be on. But for all intents and purposes, it was me and God. And he tells me in this encounter, you're my guy for testimonies. And my response to him was, I'm not your God. This is what I kind of describe as my Moses moment. I literally was like, I'm not your guy, God. There's got to be somebody else. And God's response was, you're my guy for testimonies. And I'm like, I'm not your guy. There has to be somebody else. And on the third round of this, he's like, you're my guy for testimonies. And at that point, I relented. I mean, what other choice would I have had anyway? But initially I told him, no, I'm not your guy. And then I said, no, I'm not your guy. There's got to be somebody else. And then the third time I'm like, okay, I have no idea what this means, but I'll do it. And this all occurs through prayer and conversation and spoken word out loud as prayer, and I'm on my knees on this rooftop. And I can specifically remember that the song Waymaker was being played. And I think it was the Leland version of Waymaker. But that was on as I was having this crazy, crazy, wild encounter with God where he says, you're my guy for testimonies. And I have what I felt like was my Moses moment where I'm like, can't be me. It's got to be somebody else. So as I mentioned, at the end of these breakout times, these individual times, we'd come back together to debrief. And I'm thinking to myself, I can't tell anybody about this because I don't want this to seem prideful or arrogant, that I just had this crazy, wild, fully enveloping experience with God, because there's no way anybody else did. So we come back together in the debrief, And, Michael, who was leading at that point, opens things up and basically, asks for people to share. And I'm like, I'm definitely not sharing about this. And I'll just take a sit and wait kind of approach, see how this goes, basically. So this woman, Bonnie, speaks up immediately, and she starts describing this absolutely mind-bending, fully enveloped experience that she had with God, literally at the exact same time that I'm having mine. And I know that this is occurring because I knew her. I was at that point more than acquaintances because we'd spent the last number of days doing mission work together in a foreign land. And I knew exactly where she was, which was not that many feet or yards away from me. And at the exact same time that I'm having, as mentioned, this enveloping face-to-face encounter, she's having the same type of thing with God. So she tells her story, and it's amazing. And somebody else tells their encounter and their amazing story. And I didn't share that night what happened with me. But what was crystal clear to me by the Holy Spirit really revealing it was that God is so much bigger than I thought he was. Because here I was experiencing this one-to-one exchange with him where I was completely enveloped in him and completely consumed. And yet he was capable of having that same type of experience with not just me. And I knew ultimately that that was occurring at the same time based on the stories that the other folks were sharing. So I agree and say, okay, I am going to move forward with testimonies. I have no idea what ultimately this means. I came back from that Niger trip, and through prayer, it seemed as if I was supposed to spin up an app, a testimonies related app. And so I spun that up in a pilot version, and it really didn't take flight. So lots of things were going on in that period of time. This was now full-blown COVID because we are now not February of 2020, but we're March of 2020. And so while the app got stood up, nothing really happened with that, and it all kind of fizzled out. In 2023, the idea really re-emerges in the form of a podcast. And so I reached out to my sister because she was hosting a live radio program at the time. And I said, why don't we both co-host this? We can have a male perspective. We can have a female perspective. We'll interview folks. It'll be great. And she said, yeah, let's explore it. So we filmed a pilot episode. We got a sense for how this might flow. And as she and I were having many brainstorming conversations around this time, I am telling her about the story that I dubbed 6052, which ultimately ended up being episode 1 here for When You Look, which dropped on April 7th, 2025. And she's telling me about this other crazy story involving 2124 and 2421. And that ultimately became episode 7. And we're having this conversation, and I'm emphatically sharing about 6052, and she's emphatically sharing about 2421 and 2124. And I said to her, I'm like, God is in all of these stories. And she goes, yeah, when you look. And that is exactly how the name was born, because at that moment, I knew that's it. So when you have a name and you want to go public with a name, what do? You go to the internet and you try and find the domain name. And that's exactly what we did. And whenyoulook.com and whenyoulook.org were all taken. So we thought, okay, maybe we could do whenyoulookpodcast.com. Well, we didn't really like that idea. And so ultimately in 2023, for many reasons, the wind falls out of the sails. And that was the end of the whole thing. But in 2025, it reemerges. And I am writing some notes about how can we more effectively communicate with the men at church? And I wrote podcast with a question mark next to it. And my thinking was, maybe we need a podcast to create some engagement and communicate effectively with the guys at church. It's truly just literally an idea. And at that moment, as I'm writing podcast, what then came to mind was When You Look. And I immediately dismissed it because, as mentioned, whenyoulook.com and whenyoulook.org were not available. So it really made no sense for me to put any more thought into that. But something prompted me, and I thought, okay, well, I got a little bit of time here to myself. I'll ask ChatGPT for some other ideas. So I asked ChatGPT, what are some other podcast names that are kind of like When You Look? And it spit out 10 of them. And I didn't like any of them. One of them seemed like remotely interesting, and I don't even remember what it was. But I went then to GoDaddy.com and put in that particular domain name. And I don't even remember if it was available or not, because I didn't really even care. I didn't really even like the name. I was almost going through these actions for literally no reason. But then at that point, I'm like, well, I'm already here, meaning I'm already on GoDaddy.com. I'll just check again to see if When You Look is available. So I type in whenyoulook.com, and I kid you not, it's available. And I'm like, man, that's weird. So I type in whenyoulook.org, and that's available. And I'm like, this is crazy, because this definitely wasn't available in 2023. And as I had recalled, not only was it not available, but there was actually a website for it. Now, my memory may or may not be correct on whether or not there was a website, but for sure, those domain names in 2023 were not available. And in early January of 2025, they were. And then 5 minutes later, they weren't, because they were then registered to me. The fact that the domain names were available at that point in January of 2025 was green light number one for the When You Look show. And at that point, I'm like, man, okay, well, this could be something. This could actually be something. So I should probably put together a bit of an overview, bring this thing to life, essentially. So I created a one-page document for it to really kind of sketch out what it would look like. And I had already had a lunch scheduled with a buddy of mine named Justin. And as we sat down to eat a couple of days later, after all of this went down with the domain name, and I began to put this one pager together, we're kind of just chit-chatting like we normally would at the beginning of a lunch conversation. And I said to him, I was like, hey, I'm starting this podcast, and here's an overview of it. And so I handed him the one pager. And the reason I did that was I was like, I'm not a guy with a thing. And for me to sit down across the table from my buddy and be like, yeah, I'm going to start a podcast is probably something that he would have, or really anybody that knew me would have just literally laughed. And so I gave him the one pager, essentially just as evidence of like, I'm really not kidding when I say this. Like, this is not really pie in the sky. I think I'm going to actually do this. And I said to him, I was like, okay, look, this is going to be a video podcast. And dude, you know everything there is to know about pretty much everything, especially in the AV world. So save me 25 or 40 hours worth of research and just tell me what I should buy. So he starts in with, he's like, okay, well, first thing is you're going to need a microphone. And I'm like, okay, I know that, Justin. Okay. Like I'm not that dense. And he's like, and you're going to need a camera. And I'm like, I got that one too. You know what I mean? And so we were laughing our way through this, but then he starts rattling off all of these specifics. And I am feverishly taking notes. And so he starts telling me about Shure microphones and about DSLR cameras and the lens that you're going to need and this, that, and the other thing. And then he stops and he looks at me and he goes, I have all of this. I'll bring it over next week. We'll set it up together. You try it out. You use it as long as you need it. And I looked at him as he's saying this, and I knew at that exact moment that that was green light number 2. God was taking away any bit of initial financial expense to start this, because cameras, mics, all of that are thousands of dollars. And not that we didn't necessarily have that, but that was going to be a conversation I was going to have with my wife. And he took all of that away. And so a week or so later, Justin comes over, we set it all up, and we had literally everything that we needed from the hardware in order to be able to launch When You Look, which again was green light number 2. Now, When You Look had always been, at least in my plan, to be something that I did sort of off the side of my desk, meaning I was fully employed in the workforce. I have a family, wife, 3 kids, life, house, all of that type of stuff. And so while I was very intent on glorifying God through the When You Look show, it was always going to be sort of a on the side type of thing for me. At least that was my plan. Well, God changed things with my employment at the end of January. And so I was going to be moving from one employer to another. That totally blew up. And it was crystal to my wife and I that ultimately this blowing up was God's plan. And so we together agreed that I was going to step out of the traditional workforce, at least temporarily, and leave the organization that I was with, because ultimately moving to the new company, despite signed offer letter, blew up, and it was just crystal clear to us that it was God who blew it all up. So my plan was I was going to move from employer A to employer B, continue to do When You Look off the side of my desk. And then it turns out that God had a different plan. So on January 24th, which was the last day of my employment with the company that I was with, I called my buddy Joe, told him the whole situation, and he congratulates me of all things when I told him, hey, I'm unemployed. And he says, let's do a 3-day fast and see what God has in store for all of this. So I'm like, okay, cool. Let's do it. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of the following week was the plan for the 3-day fast. And now, because I was transitioning from one employer to another, or at least that was my plan, and then all of that blew up. And because I'm the breadwinner in the family, I'm like, I'll work my contacts and relationships and do everything that I can to try and secure new employment. And so that Friday, I'm working on contacts and those types of things. That Saturday, I did a bunch of reaching out. That Monday and that Tuesday. And so I've reached out to lots and lots of people, essentially just kind of beginning to get feelers out there for new employment. And so Wednesday morning, which is the beginning of day 3 of this fast, my wife says to me that morning, she says, hey, I think you've done enough. Meaning, I don't think you need to keep looking for work right now. And transparently, I gave her a look like, you're out of your mind. Until I have a paycheck, I haven't done enough. So we talked about it a little bit, and she's like, no, I think you have. I mean, you've reached out to a lot of people, and, like, God's got this. And I'm like, look, until I have a paycheck, I haven't done enough. So there was a tiny bit of tension here because she's like, I think you have. I'm like, no way. Like, no way, no way, no way, no way. So because we both knew that I was in the midst of a 3-day fast, that and we had a little bit of a rhythm at that point, that like kind of like after the morning family breakfast routine was done, that I would go upstairs and I would pray. And so I said to her, I was like, all right, I'll pray about it. So I went upstairs And as I was praying, God literally gives me 3 bullet points: sit and wait, complete surrender, full trust. And what was so crystal clear as it related to sit and wait meant stop looking for work. And I mean, it was crystal. I knew exactly what he meant. He was very clear with all of this, because ultimately during that fast, he had been incredibly responsive, incredibly available, and I was getting all kinds of amazing answer to prayer and insight and clarity from God during this particular fast. So the sit and wait was crystal clear. Stop looking for work. So later that morning, after I'm done praying, I end up going down back to my wife to say what every guy loves to say: you were right, honey. So I told her the story, explained how it all went down, and God was making it very clear that I was to stop looking for work. So I spent the next 3 or 4 days squirming, because I'm an action-oriented guy. I'm supposed to, as far as I'm concerned, have a job. I don't have one of those. And he's told me, he being the God of the universe, has told me, sit and wait, stop looking for work. And then after a couple of days, I start asking him, okay, it's been a couple days. Can I start looking for work now? And it was sort of like me as a 5-year-old being in timeout. It was like, okay, the 5 minutes up. Can I get up off the steps, or can I get up out of the timeout chair? Can I get out of timeout, please, and go back to looking for work? No response. So I asked him, probably went down like every other day. It was sort of like easing back into this, because he was crystal clear, like, stop looking for work. And then it kind of got to every day. And then it went back to every other day. And at certain points, I would ask, can I start looking for work now? That closed end question. And then eventually I'm like, okay, I haven't heard from God. I'm not getting any response about any of this. Maybe I'll ask it a different way. So I asked it. I was like, what is your plan for me, God? Which was totally just code for, can I start looking for work again? And after about 3 weeks, so this would now be late February, during prayer, the Holy Spirit said to me, quote, shut your mouth and stop asking me about this in prayer. Sit and wait means sit and wait, end quote. Now, that was amazing, because first and foremost, the God of the universe was that crystal clear with me, because that's what I needed to hear. Shut your mouth and stop asking me about this in prayer. Sit and wait means sit and wait. And then it also became clear that I had basically been disrespectful because I continued to ask and continued to ask. So I immediately repented. And I thanked him for his mercy in that he shared with me exactly what I needed to hear. And I was sorry and apologized and repented and confessed. I'm like, I'm so sorry that I was disrespectful with this. And thank you for the clarity that you've given. And so from that point forward, I didn't ask him. And every time I started talking to people about when you look, people that I fully expected would have a response that would kind of go like this. Oh, that's cool. Just completely dismissive, or even like, you're going to do what? Every time I talk to people, their response went like this. I got a story for you. Like, without hesitation. I mean, some of these people were acquaintances, like meaning people that I barely knew, having no idea any of their backstory, anything along these lines. And their response was, I got a story for you. And I'm thinking, okay, great, fine. So I would say, well, give me 10 seconds. Like, tell me your story. What does this sound like? And then 5 minutes later, I'm picking my jaw up off the floor because people have told me these stories that are absolutely mind-blowing. The blowing up of the new job, the additional clarity from God of sit and wait, meaning stop looking for work, and then sort of this knowing in that whole process that I want you to work on when you look. And then every time I talked with people about the podcast, their response was, I have a story, was a series of the third, the fourth, the fifth, and countless more scenarios of green light, green light, green light. So the podcast launched publicly on April 7th, 2025. We did a launch party on April 11th, which was entirely God's idea. Because I asked him, how do you want this thing to launch? How do you want this thing to grow? And he said, launch party. So we had the launch party, and we now have well over a dozen episodes that are public. We have so many more that have already been recorded. And the stories, friends, are mind-bending. And the things that God has planned, well, he hasn't revealed them to me, but I know for sure they're going to bring him glory. So that, my friends, is how When You Look came to be. It's been crystal clear to me and my family that all of this is exactly what God wants me to be doing. And it is my intention to be obedient to him and to do what it is that he wants me to do. So thanks a bunch for listening. I genuinely want you guys to weigh in the comments. Tell me what you think about everything that you've heard. It's a wild and crazy story. And man, there's so many different additional details that I left out. So weigh in the comments and let me know what you think. And then do me a favor and subscribe, share this, share other episodes, because these are all stories for his glory. Until next time, God bless.